She also introduced me and told some of my affiliations I wear a lot of different hats. But what I try to do as a side to my professional endeavors is provide a lot of free information out to the global security community to protect networks, because not everybody can afford lots of expensive security products, particularly consumers. When you go home, friends and family, I'm sure, may ask you, how do I protect myself? And you're like, well, install antivirus and then don't click on things in email. So I try to provide some information to help make some of that work. A graph I like to use in most of my talks to kind of explain my perspective on things. This is from VirusTotal, and it's a graph of how many unique malware samples are submitted to VirusTotal every day. And the orange line is they have 300,000 unique samples submitted on May 20th that I did at the airport on the way here is when I pulled this chart. No one can reverse engineer all that. There's a whole lot of information out there, but that's what we can detect today. The scary number is between the orange and green line, because that's the number of malware samples that we don't detect that are still malicious. But we know an awful lot about a threat as security professionals. We often struggle with information overload. We have too much information and we don't know what's important and what's not. We struggle with ways to make use of that, and that's why this talk is one way to make use of this at a fairly low cost price point. Another thing that's on my mind is one of the features of technology, particularly American technology companies, are finding more and more ways to get information about us. And this is a fairly large book. It's about as big as a Bible, but goes through a lot of information about Facebook and Google. The Internet of Things companies are creating more and more ways to get information about us and our private lives to sell us stuff. And that is something that I would like to reduce, and I'm sure that many of you would also, because we like to just be private in our private lives. I don't know if I really care if anybody knows what kind of diapers I buy for my kids. I just don't really want people mining everything that I do and creating some profile for me. But we have these devices that are listening into our homes, right? This is an Amazon Alexa that's been in the news last week, I believe. And one of the things that Amazon wants to do is have this device listening to people speaking even without giving it its wake word. So it can create voice profiles and do all sorts of interesting things that Amazon wants to do data science on. And bear in mind, one of Amazon's biggest companies or contracts is the United States Department of Defense. So they're also a defense contractor that are leveraging some of the technologies of voice recognition and facial recognition for military applications. But these devices are in our homes listening to what we do. So there's two particular threats that I'm concerned about. I assume many of you are concerned about. And the first is cybercrime. I'm not really worried about me clicking on stuff. I have tons of malware on my laptop, and that's because I reverse engineer it. But I have young kids, I have 6 kids, who like finding games on the internet, and every time I find their laptop, they find some new malicious garbage that they downloaded under the guise of some game. There's not much to compromise for children, but it's designed to get towards me and my wife and our finances. But also minimizing the amount of information that's just leaked about me every day as I go about my business. In the United States, and I assume in other countries, there's a big debate about monitoring DNS queries in terms of the host names you go to as you go out through the internet, and internet service providers want to use that information to create marketing profiles. Well, I can tell an awful lot about somebody based off of what host names they're going to and about their day-to-day business. I could tell who they work for. I could tell what kind of companies they shop with and frequent. There might be, personal information or adult web surfing that they're doing they might not want flagged in a profile. So lots of information that to be protected against. But all of this requires DNS to work. And it's actually relatively amazing. DNS was written in 1980, before there was a web browser, before when people were still using dial-up modems, before any of the technologies that were invented, were invented in what we know as the internet today. There was DNS, and it basically works the same way it did in 1980. It takes names and turns them into numbers. It's decentralized, where you can, establish domain rights to various organizations and countries. The system more or less works at a global scale and has since the 1980s. Since we use it, malware also uses it. Almost every malware config out there will use a DNS name to reach out to something. And all of the ad tracking and surveillance that goes on also uses DNS to reach out to send information. If those things didn't work, they didn't resolve, then those services wouldn't run. Which is, in essence of this talk, is using DNS to protect against malware, against those threats to privacy that are out there. But it's this transparent thing that all of us use every day that makes the internet work that many people don't even think about, even in corporate environments, right? Even IoT devices that you can't modify. You can't modify an Amazon Alexa, but it uses DNS, and you can modify how the responses to that DNS query that it makes to get it to do more preferential things. As a relatively brief overview, I'm sure many of you know what DNS is, but it's a hierarchical system. You go to your resolver, you say, I want to go to www.google.com. It queries the root servers, where's .com if it's not cached, where's google.com, and then it goes to Google and says, where is www? But the important thing about this graph is the most important device down there is the user's primary DNS server of the resolver. If you control that, you control every device on the network. Criminals have known this for well over a decade, that if they modify DNS to pick a bank website, then instead of going to the bank you think you're going to, then you're going to some criminal's website. We can do this also for more beneficial results. I'm going to block lookups for phishing domains or malware domains or ad tracking. By default, when most people use DNS in the home environments and even in small business environments, they use whatever their internet service provider gives them. They plug in their router, it gets a DNS setting over DHCP, and everybody ignores it. Probably the only exception to this rule is how many people use 8.8.8.8 for DNS? Okay. Well, that's new, but yeah, there's Cloudflare also, right? You have Google, and now you have Cloudflare, right? How many people use 9.9.9.9? That's the only open resolver that actually blocks malicious traffic. Cloudflare and Google won't censor. Quad 9s will, but we'll get to that in a minute. But by and large, people just don't think about it. You can bypass it, you can set it on your devices. I can set whatever DNS setting on my iPhone that I wanted. But in the case of Google, for people who set it to 8.8.8.8, how many people don't think Google is paying attention to what they're querying and creating marketing profiles? So, Google is happy to have your DNS traffic and provides a fairly solid and responsive DNS service. It works to resolve host names. They just happen to use that information also. The same is true for internet service providers or any other entity, with the exception of Quad 9s, and we'll talk about that, right? Like I said, if you control your own DNS resolver, you can control where that information goes, and you can keep it all private if you want to, you can expose it if you want to, and you can block whatever you want to because it is yours. One aspect of DNS that allows this is called response policy zones. This is built into the DNS protocol, and it's basically a special zone you put into your DNS server, and I'll show you examples of this in a minute, that says if you're looking for a specific record, it will return a different response than what the authoritative name server wants. So instead of going to badsite.com, you could get NX domain. It just says, I don't know anything about that. It could redirect it to a different IP address. You can have some fun with that. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's already built into Bind. The one that you can install with apt-get or RPM. You can use it right out of the box. It's also supported in Active Directory. Where a version of it in Active Directory. They don't call it response policy zones, but it does the same thing, where you can modify or blacklist certain requests over DNS. There are 4 different indicator types that response policy zones can block or detect. One is the specific thing that you're querying, or a wildcard version. You're looking for www.google.com. You could redirect that somewhere else. You could use star.google.com if you want to block an entire domain. or star.pw if you want to block the entire nation of Palau, which is actually not a bad thing to do because that top level domain is run by basically a criminal organization. So there's a whole lot of abusive domains in Palau. You can block based off the IP address that it resolves to. Right? We know lots of IP addresses are malicious. There's lots of lists out there. We'll talk about that in a second. And DNS also requires authoritative servers. So Google.com has authoritative name servers responsible for telling people querying resources under Google. You can blacklist specific name servers that you think are malicious, which is an aspect of my research that I'm doing for my PhD, but we won't go into that here. What you can do, you can return NX domain, which is the DNS code for saying this doesn't exist. You can return no data. You can point it to something else. So in a corporate environment, you can point it to a sinkhole if you wanted to get some notification, hey, this machine is infected with malware, and then they see a web page pop up saying, you've done something bad, stop doing that, or take the machine and be clean. So you can do lots of various things with that that you want, right? One of the things that I do at home when my kids now go to games or things that they shouldn't do, they can be redirected to something that says, Dad knows what you're doing, stop it. All sorts of fun you can have with your children with this, and your spouse. But that's another story altogether. This basically looks like a DNS zone with some subtle differences. I don't know how many people have configured their own name server before, their own name server zones. It's all based off of text files that's got its own syntax, but not overly complicated. You have a list of host names over here. There's a wildcard, CNAME, and then dot says it returns NX domain. You can use star dot, or you can put an IP address in there to redirect it. Fairly simple to configure, so it's all a for loop, basically. That I've got a list of bad IP addresses, I've got a list of bad host names, I iterate all through that, and I attach the header up on top that has some various time-to-live values and a serial number. The same thing's true with IP addresses, except it's done in reverse notation, because in DNS, IP addresses are reversed because of the hierarchy involved. But you can also do net blocks. So in this case, you're blocking 5.8.37.0 and that whole subnet there. There's lots of entire networks that we know are bad. Spamhaus, an anti-spam company, publishes lists of just bad net blocks used by spammers and scammers that you could populate into there and start blocking entire bulletproof hosting networks fairly quickly. You can do the same thing with name servers. You see the same thing here, where it says RPZ-NSDNAME and NSIP, where you've got the host name in there, and then you've got, again, the reverse IP address, which you could do by net blocks. It's a fairly simple text-based way to configure it. The trick is, of course, getting the data and what you want to populate into that. We'll talk about that in a second. But one problem that I had, at least with my own kids, is we have a smart TV at home because you can't apparently buy in the United States just normal televisions anymore. So they like watching YouTube videos on the internet. It's got a little YouTube channel on the smart TV. Well, on a laptop, I could sit there and do cookies and force safe search to keep my 5-year-old from watching videos that a 5-year-old shouldn't be watching. You can't really do that on a smart TV because there's no cookies. There's nothing to interact with. But on using DNS settings, because the smart TV just uses DNS, I want to go to youtube.com and it does whatever the network tells it to do. Well, Google and YouTube and Bing and others have created ways to, in DNS, force various safe search things to prevent adult material and inappropriate things for minors. And you see an example in there with Google where you can redirect Google searches to its safe search. Or for YouTube, they have 2 different versions of restrict and restrict moderate, because there's 3 different settings there. And you do the same thing with Bing, where you just do a CNAME of www.bing.com to restrict.bing.com. You do it in DNS. I've never touched a smart TV. I don't have to. The network just tells it you're only allowed to go here, and then all of a sudden they can't see whatever obnoxious YouTube videos that they can get out there. So it's one particular use case that's at least good for my kids. Because as I said, there is a cache, right? The configuration, the tools have been there. They've been there for some time. Not a lot of people use them because you have to find the data. Now the good news is there's lots of data out there. We'll go over that in a couple of slides. But there's dozens of lists out there with malicious host names and domain names. I produce one that's about 1 million domain names. There's hundreds of IP lists. Most of those are actually free for consumers and not free for businesses. So there's lots of people who produce lots of great information and give it away, but nobody really helps to enable a way to make that usable for people. And we'll talk, like I said, towards the end of that. Some of these are documented, some of them are not, right? There is some nuance in the data, and there might be some whitelisting and curation you have to do if you implement it, because as with anything free, right, you make up for the free by having to make sure that the data is clean. But if in your home or a small business, odds are, if you're blocking some website innocently in Ukraine, you're probably not going to access it anyway, so does it really matter? But there is lots of data out there to be had. You just need to make sure that you're not blocking stuff that's important to you and having the whitelist. This is an example of a curated feed from Stephen Black. He has a GitHub repository that you see the link there. But he separates out data in various classes, right? If you want to block all the malicious stuff, the unified host is adware and malware, you see other kind of lists on there. If you want to block fake news, if you want to block social networks, if you want to block pornography or gambling or all of the above, you can pick and choose which link in there and start populating RPC with that, right? So the data is fairly usable and about 40 to 50,000 domain names. Not a lot, but a good enough start to get started and block a fair number of things. And these are updated on a daily basis. So as domains get taken down or suspended and new domains come up, there's a change there. But this one blocks adware, for instance, and some of the various pervasive pop-up, annoying pop-up ad networks that you see. But there's lots of data out there. These slides will be available to you, so don't feel the need to write all this down. But this is just a partial list from one website of the number of abusive lists of abusive domains out there. There are lots of them, and some of them, slice and dice depending on however you want. There's lots of data, and as I said at the beginning of this talk, we're not at a loss for data. We're at a loss of tools to make it useful and do something interesting things with. And a couple of slides, we'll get there, right? But one thing I want to make a point of is making your own data and making your own list and making that available to others. Is that often threats you see may not be the same threats that I see. Different countries see different things. Different people in different organizations see different things. And nobody really has a truly global perspective, right? Things that happen here may not happen in the United States, and things that happen in the United States may not happen here. But certainly you can take whatever you see and whatever you care about blocking and create open resources. There's always a need for more people doing that and curating it. All those lists I showed you on the previous slide is done for volunteer work, right? Nobody gets paid to do that. And all the anti-ad tracking and surveillance stuff is almost all volunteer effort. It takes somebody who's sitting there figuring out how Google and Amazon and Facebook is trying to track you today, and then they publish it to a URL or GitHub or whatever. So it's not overly complicated, it just takes time and effort. And as security professionals, I argue that we have some duty to broader society to help make life better for people beyond just what we're getting paid to do. So certainly, creating feeds of data, I think, is important. I'll talk about a couple of my experiences of creating feeds. There's two main sources of feeds that I'm known for creating. One based on domain generation algorithms, right? A DGA is basically a mathematical formula that takes some input and then turns it into a list of domain names. Malware started using this around 2012, 2011, because we got to be better about taking down domains and getting domains suspended. So they coded these DGAs in malware so that whenever the malware started, it would say, I'm going to go query these lists of 1,000 domains. They would register 2 or 3 of them. If we got them suspended, then they would register 2 or 3 more. It was a way to keep running over long periods of time. Well, the benefit of them running DGAs and having long-term infrastructure, long-term algorithm of what domains are going to use, is allowed me to reverse engineer that, figure out what domains they're going to use in a given week, try to resolve any of that and put it into a feed. So as you see at the bottom of the slide, there's 2 domain names used by Tiny Banker, which is a banking Trojan. So it's fairly easy it was fairly easy to create, having the algorithm. The reverse engineering was the hard part. But you see from the command at the bottom, which is in essence the entirety of what my feeds are generated on, is running that one command line of parallel, throwing a bunch of domains into asynchronous DNS and putting it into a text file to then parse it into feeds from there. Right? It's not overly complicated once you have the basic tools to work with. And that's something I've done 6 years ago, and now it's used all over the place. And then I said from there, I create lists of domains and IP addresses in name servers that are used by 11,000 some odd organizations all over the world for free. And it costs me about $100 a month in Amazon charges, right? Of creating something that's 1 million domains and malicious. Right? If you're interested in figuring out how to reverse engineer DGAs, there are a couple of GitHub repositories that I have linked on there. But Johannes Bader is a Switzerland researcher, an academic, and he does a lot of work and describes how he reverse engineers a bunch of DGAs. So if you're interested in that as a resource, you can check out his blog. But those 2 GitHub repositories have a lot of DGA scripts implemented in Python, so you can just at will start generating lists of domains. I've done the same for malware configs. Like malware is like software, which has configuration items. One of those configuration items is where it wants to talk to, an IP address, a domain name. Well, there's ways to statically reverse engineer malware very fast using the tools of that GitHub repository on the slide, where I can give it an example of Dark Comet or NJRAT or Nanocore or pick your family of malware, and then get out all the configuration item from that, and then populate a feed with that. So I've got a list of usually dynamic DNS host names that are used by malware remote access tools. So fairly easy to use and then put into a network to start protecting things. That resource is available at that URL if you want to get access to it using the malware information sharing platform NIST. This is what it looks like in the output. Fairly simple. There's no dynamic aspect to it. It just parses out the file itself and rips out the config from just a file. So if you've got copies of malware, you can run these decoders against it. In this case, you see Dark Comet that's got a ddns.net hostname of 0605 whatever. As many of you know, dynamic DNS providers tend to be heavily favored by a lot of criminals. There's lots of other data in there that's useful for other reasons, but for DNS, I could probably block that. I know I can block that because nothing ever legitimately will use it. So, going back to making feeds of badness, right? All of us see lots of things in our email folders, antivirus alerts, web access logs, and forever, and whatever. As an example, one area of my research is the various sextortion Bitcoin scams that people that have been going out the past 6, 8 months, where you've been, it says you've been going to naughty places on the internet, send me however much in Bitcoin. Those Bitcoin wallets are immensely useful, and the same is true for ransomware. You can't use it in DNS, but creating feeds of that helps track the people behind that down, and the same is true for DNS. Saying, oh, I've seen this scam with this URL and this domain name, and creating feeds of that to broader society. 1, helps us all protect each other, and 2, it helps the cause of prosecution and identifying the individuals behind this. So, in order to make this work, you've got feeds of data, but running blind may be scary to some people, right? It's certainly not something you probably can go to your parents to do and say, oh, I'm going to run a bind name server at your house and I'm going to teach you how to administer that. That's probably not going to work. But there is another easy open source project that really does make easy use of this data, called Pi-hole. runs on a Raspberry Pi, fairly simple to install, and we'll go over that instructions here fairly quickly. And then it's just a question of just adding links to whatever domains you want to block. By default, it was a project born of ad tracking and surveillance. So its out-of-the-box configuration will block the various forms of ad tracking and surveillance that goes on of how people monetize their websites. But it blocks things and it whitelists things, and you can block or whitelist anything you want. So you can put in as many or many feeds of data that make sense to you to block things. There's an easy-to-use web interface that you can log into, see what's going on. I'll show you a couple of screenshots of it here. But the best part of that is if you're running your own resolver, it's private, meaning it's not, the queries aren't going to your ISP. You know, they'll be routed to the authoritative name server. Google will know that you're looking up Google.com, but they won't know that you're looking up anything else. Because there's lots of attempts to monetize DNS traffic specifically because it's very useful to create profiles about people. This is how easy it is to install. You install Raspbian on a Raspberry Pi, or any of the operating systems represented there, and you run that one curl script. It'll go through a various text-based user interface, so we'll ask you some questions, one of which is to set the password for the admin interface, but you run curl, and it just works. And fairly, like I said, fairly simple to install. You can run it in Docker, you can run it wherever you want. There is one additional step. Because it is a DNS resolver, you've got to tell your devices to use that instead of whatever the ISP provided default is. So on my network, right, I've got an access point behind the router I get from my cable company. And by default, it says, okay, use this name server, here's your IP address. I simply point it to an internal IP address corresponding to my Raspberry Pi. Then all of the devices on my network now magically start querying the Raspberry Pi instead of my ISP for DNS queries, right? Including the IoT devices, including all of the various things, because everything uses DNS and everything uses DHCP to figure out its network settings. So this works on everything fairly quickly, even those devices that you can't otherwise modify because there's no access to them. The trick is many access points and home routers can make that difficult and non-intuitive. I have DDWRT on my home access point, so that's fairly simple, right? But if you're using a cable access point and access router, you might not even be able to access that device. Or it might be made difficult to you, and it varies, right? Any particular access point that's not DDWRT, well, how you configure that may be simple or complicated and will vary on every device. If it breaks, everything at home breaks. So right now I'm about, I don't know how many kilometers it is, about 6,000 miles away from home. If my kids and my wife can't get to Netflix and YouTube, I'd be hearing about it right now. I'm in no place to fix it for them. The good news is this device has never broken in months. It's still running and there's no issues. But if there is, then you have to figure out a way to bypass it. You can bypass it on a per device basis, or you have to log back into the access point and change things. Every now and then, things that I don't want my kids to see get blocked for me, because I'm a security researcher sometimes. I go places I'd rather my kids not go to. So I've got to bypass DNS traffic to keep doing my work at home, or use a VPN. And if a local machine statically configures its own DNS server, then it will bypass your Pi hole and there'll be no protection, right? Almost nothing does that. The only device I've ever encountered that does that is my own laptop when I've explicitly made it do it. But all the IoT devices, for whatever reason, just use whatever the network provides them, which is somewhat surprising. I think that I would have surprised that they didn't just use themselves as DNS servers to capture more information. Here's what the main dashboard looks like. Gives you query volumes and lets you kind of know what's going on. This one is the one provided by them, or the image provided by Holt. There are 17,000 queries in the last hour. 1,000 were blocked. 6.5% of the queries are blocked. Right? You see nice little pretty graphs. You see an idea of what responses and what types of queries are going on. This can be very interesting. for people who are kind of curious about what their devices are doing, especially if you have a lot of smart devices at home, is to get an idea of what's going on with the traffic that they're generating. They don't really make it easy to see what you're doing, so either you've got to sniff it, or you can set something up like this and say, no, this device is querying over IPv6, right? So in this network you see, I don't know, about an eighth of it is IPv6 traffic. It's interesting, I don't know what I do with that, but it gives you some insights as to what's going on in your network. One of the other beneficial things this does, because DNS, the DNS Pi-hole doesn't run full RPZ, it runs DNS mask, which basically operates as a forwarder. It'll block some things and then forward requests of whatever it doesn't know about. You can set where queries are forwarded to. So you see several examples, right? Google is in there, Cloudflare with Cloud Runs is in there, Quad 9's 9.9.9 is in there. You could do this over DNS over TLS or DNS over HTTP with a little extra work, so that no one can even sniff your DNS traffic, because DNS by default is unencrypted over UDP on port 53, right? Well, if it's DNS over HTTP, or HTTPS, well then all it does, the only one it would ever see is that you're just sending secure web traffic to Quad 9s or 1.1.1.1 or Google or wherever you're sending it, and no one except the person serving the request would see it. Now the important advantage of Quad 9s, in addition to being the only one that, well I should say, Quad 9s and OpenDNS will block malicious stuff. Quad 9s is the only one that keeps your queries private. Or at least they commit to it, right? You know, I tend to believe it because I provide them data and they won't provide me block logs, so I don't even get any data from those queries of the data that I provide them. So despite Quad 9s having some measure of visibility into what you're querying, they don't provide that to any third parties, so you maintain a degree of privacy. Then adding list is a simple feature of just going to block list or whitelist, and just putting a URL in there of whatever list you want to add. The system itself is pretty smart in terms of figuring out exactly what it wants to block over a variety of formats, so I just picked out two. The top one, I think, is malware domains, which just lists domains. And the other one is the bottom servers, hostfile.net. You see that IP address and host name. It figures that out in terms of what you actually want to block. So it's not very strict in terms of how it parses data. And like I said, it's fairly simple. Just say, okay, this is a good feed. I'll put it in there. They have an active Reddit community, so as new feeds get taken in or taken out, or you have questions, you can go to Reddit and ask what other people are putting in there, and they're always talking about lists in terms of what people put in and how they do whitelists and clean the data. Like I said, it doesn't run full RPZ. It just blocks, it runs DNS mask and blocks known host names and wildcards, which is good, right? That still gives a whole lot of protection, but it doesn't have any capability of blocking IP addresses. And it does need to be local, or if anybody has any wants to administer it, they also have to be local to the device also, right? Which is not that big of a deal. You know, we could set up a home VPN or whatever, or for a small business either, but it's not really amenable to enterprise deployment because there's no good way to manage 1,000 of them. But that's okay. This talk is about how using DNS to protect yourself inexpensively. Right? And some of that means that if I'm protecting myself at home, I'll be home every now and then. So what I do at home and how I've set my network up is the first, I have DNS running full RPZ. I use my company's policy, which is commercial, because I develop it, and it lets me kind of curate my own data to make sure that I'm not blowing up my customers. I see that I'm blowing myself up first. But we have a free version of the policy that you can get if you sign up with us. I run to another Raspberry Pi that's running Pi-hole, and then I forward everything to Quad 9s over a secure connection. So for the cost of 2 Raspberry Pis with case, SD card, and all this stuff, is about $120 to $130 US, or $600 here. You know, and then forwarding everything to Quad 9s, I block a whole lot of stuff, including the safe search and the YouTube stuff that I've talked about earlier, right? But in some more details of what I've noticed, right, in terms of capacity, a Raspberry Pi is a pretty neat device. but it is constrained in terms of resources. On the Pi-hole, I can block about 2 million entries, host names and domains. Running bind on a Raspberry Pi, I can only block about 1 million entries. Because you're running a full resolver, it has to keep cache, it keeps a lot more things in memory versus doing a real-time lookup of saying is something blocked or not. So there's definite resource constraints in terms of what you can block, and you can block a whole lot more with a Pi-hole based off of what it does. So primarily on the first device running RPZ, I focus on bad networks and IP addresses and things not otherwise available in Pi-hole policy. Then focus on all the privacy stuff in the Pi-hole and big lists of domains, and then quad 9 to pick up anything else that's left over. So provide some pretty decent, relatively robust protection, at least for my family, right? I don't know if it would protect me from the NSA or Russia, but if it stops 95% of criminal stuff and my kids or my wife clicking on something stupid, I'll take that as a win. And like I said, I run this over DNS over HTTP on that last lane, so my ISP can't see the traffic. I've been running this for a few months now. I do travel internationally, and I'm kind of the only tech support for my family. So if things break, I get angry calls, and I've not gotten them yet. You know, my wife's phone is broken, but that's her phone's problem, not the network. But it hasn't interrupted. There's been no hang-ups. My cable service has gone down, you know, a couple of times. That happens. But these devices are relatively resilient, and they just run for a long time. It's flash storage, so eventually it will fail. But like I said, it's been running months without interruption. I've not even rebooted them. They run relatively hands-free, so fairly stable and could work for a small business. I don't know if I would trust, like I said, a major enterprise to this. A major enterprise, okay, I'm going to use actual server hardware for DNS. But if you're a small office or can't afford lots of stuff, this can provide you a whole lot of protection at a fairly low cost point, and all the data is already out there and free. You just may have to whitelist things every now and then. And as brings me to my second goal. When I first set it up, there were a couple of things that I had to whitelist because just applications wouldn't work because of how they were tied into ad tracking networks. So I had a one-by-one case. I could say, okay, this didn't work, so I've got to whitelist this. And you can do that entry by entry in Pi-hole interface. In fact, if you look in query log, you can just, if you see the queries in real time, you can just click whitelist and it will whitelist whatever the underlying query was. So it's fairly simple with some tuning that took me, I don't know, about an hour. I haven't touched it, the whitelisting, in months. And like I said, it's still working. And all of the Google Safe Search and that stuff operates on smart TVs and iPads and other devices that I don't otherwise have access to. So one of the things, like I said, in prepping this talk that I gave thought of is discussions I've had, you know, over the years is there's been, you know, with the advent of the Facebooks and the Gmails of the world saying, oh, don't run your own email server, don't run your DNS server, it's too complicated and you don't have the time to secure it. You know, we'll do all of that for you, and oh, by the way, we'll mine all of this stuff about you and create profiles and sell that to the highest bidder. There hasn't been a compromise of a mail server in 10 years. Email accounts, yes, usernames and passwords, but nobody has compromised postfix or Exim, right? You know, bind is secure basically out of the box, especially if you're running it on the inside of a network, right? You know, the whole concept of the internet was to allow, you know, people to interconnect their own devices and figure stuff out and make things work. And as time has gone on, the internet has become centralized in the hands of a very few people, which is also subject to my research I can go into, right? DNS is an example. I mentioned 2 external DNS providers, 8.8.8.8, 1.1.1.1. Everybody knows those. There are hundreds of them out there, but everybody knows Google and Cloudflare because they have the best marketing. But it doesn't have to be that way. The other thing is they provide no security in return, right? Google and Cloudflare. Cloudflare particularly likes saying, oh no, we don't believe in censorship. I'm okay with blocking ransomware and not considering that censorship. I think we can deal with blocking criminals and not go down the slippery slope of we're going to end up with a China-like regime where some government or tech company is controlling everything we see. But we can run these devices and give our own security. And like I said, there's only one organization with Quad 9s with DNS that provides you any security and querying they do without compromising your privacy at the same time. And the last point, because this is a talk about DNS, is DNS over HTTP is a relatively new development over the last year by Cloudflare, by Google, that in the coming months they want to mandate in the browser, which means by default you're going to be giving all of your DNS queries to them, and nobody's going to be able to have any visibility except them, including to protect yourself, right? This is a bad idea because it's giving the browsers, in collusion with Google's of the world, full access to information while not providing any real protection and just monetizing. I don't know where that's going to end up. They said in the next two versions of Chromium, basically it's going to be mandated, but not mandated. You'll be able to change it. But certainly if you care about privacy, pay attention to about the end of the year in Mozilla or whatever web browser you use and see if it's mandating and sending your DNS queries to some place that you'd rather not have your data go to. And the last point, to go to what I said in the middle of this talk, right? There's lots of people are creating data, but we need more. And lots of this is volunteer work because big companies will do this, but then they sell the product to big enterprises. But if you want to protect families or small businesses or people who don't have a lot of money, we rely on free tools to do that, and free information and free data to do that. So certainly there are a lot of projects out there that can help. Even if you're not creating a feed, operating sensors so that feeds can be created. One is a D-Shield Pi, one by the SANS Internet Storm Center. Basically, it's a Raspberry Pi honeypot that sits on an external network and just listens to all of the traffic that comes through. HoneyDB is another example of a Raspberry Pi that you can run honeypots to get all the brute force attacks out there. Or for those of you who run web servers or SSH and run fail-to-ban, you can also contribute that data to Abuse IPDB to help protect the ecosystem at large, right? For DNS lists, that takes work in terms of ad tracking, is just to see where things are queried and do that. But certainly we need more people helping curate those lists and get more information about bad stuff seeing on the wild. But certainly whatever you do, I encourage you to contribute data back to your own local communities and society at large. And with that, I have a couple minutes left.